Welcome back, students who are taking Math for Business and Finance and Math Applications, and we are on the Chapter 22 word problems. These are the optional word problems, and like I said, even though they weren't assigned, I'm going through them because you really can't have too much practice doing statistics. Now, we finished off with problem 8 in the last video, and 8 and 9 are kind of identical, all right? So if you watched the last video, you saw that I had referenced problems 2, 3, and 4 as the drill problems, all right, the optional ones. Okay? So if you go back and you can watch those videos covering those particular problems, which deal with the same concept matter of here's what the mean is and here's how to calculate the standard deviation. But doing those problems, you're actually seeing me do the math, okay? Whereas in problem number 8 in the last video, I didn't go over the math, all right? I went through the steps and I explained what to do, and that's the same thing I'm going to do here, because I'm not going to go through punching all of the math in the calculator. That's very, very time consuming. It took me 15 minutes to explain the last problem. Easily it could take me half an hour to do the problem, right? And the thing that you want to notice here as a difference between problems 8 and number 9 is in problem number 8, let me just back up here. Notice that the numbers are all 3 digits long, right? Okay. This problem, the data points are only 2 digits long, and you'll see that even that one extra digit makes a huge amount of difference in your, the size of the numbers that you're working with and doing the calculations. And just, from that perspective, this optional problem number 9 is just much, much easier than number 8, even though you're going to do the same exact number of steps. You're dealing with smaller numbers. It's easier to keep a handle on doing the math. All right. So before I get into doing it, again, watch the video several times. If you watch those other videos, and do watch them several times in order so that you can understand the concepts. If you don't understand the concept, after watching it several times, working through the problem, you still don't understand how it's arrived at, telephone and speak with an instructor. It is not something that can be explained via email. And for those who are taking, who are in business curriculums, and you will end up taking business statistics, it's better for you to get this stuff now, okay, so that when you do get the statistics, you'll have already seen it one time and you'll be a lot more familiar with it, and you won't, you'll be able to hit the ground running, okay, instead of having to get up from the ground, okay. If you just blow this off and you end up in statistics, well, you're going to be struggling just like you're struggling now to get this concept down, and you're only learning it, quote unquote, for the first time. Well, if you get it now in math and then you see it again in statistics, that's twice that you've seen the same material, and it'll make it just that much more easier for you in statistics. Okay, so take my advice and pay attention to what you're doing right now. Okay, right. Problem number 9. The time in seconds it takes for 20 individual sewing machines to stitch a border onto a particular garment is listed below. Calculate the mean stitching time, okay, the mean again is the average, and the standard deviation to the nearest hundredth. Right? Okay, so what is the mean? It's basically adding all of these numbers together, and since there's whatever you come for that total, which in this case here ends up being 1292, so when you add all of these together, you get 1292, and then you divide by 20, because there's 20 data points there, and so you get a mean time of 64.6. Okay, so I'm going to erase this here. All right, so I'm going to make the mean is 64.6. Okay, all right, so that's the first thing that you have to do. Now, the problem is telling you to calculate the mean stitching time and the standard deviation to the nearest hundredth. And what I'm going to point out here is, remember that one thing builds upon the other, builds upon the other. this problem is telling you to calculate the mean stitching time. Well, what if it didn't tell you to calculate the mean stitching time and it just said calculate the standard deviation? Well, you wouldn't be able to calculate the standard deviation if you didn't calculate the mean. Okay? So the problem, just because the problem doesn't tell you to calculate the mean does not mean you can't do the standard deviation. It's, the mean was a previous concept, and the standard deviation was built upon that concept. Okay, so if it just says calculate the standard deviation and you're being given data points, just realize that it's up to you to know that you have to calculate the mean first. The problem doesn't have to ask you to do it and doesn't have to tell you to do it. And that's something that students will struggle with in business statistics, because you get them, I think it's chapter 1, you deal with the mean. Chapter 3, you deal with standard deviation. But then in like chapter 7, I believe, you deal with something called binomial distribution. And in chapter 7, in statistics, the author automatically assumes that you know how to do standard deviation from chapter 3. If you don't know how to do it, you're dead in the water, because he's just going to be explaining binomial distribution. And if you don't know to take this, he's going to give you data points just like this, and he's going to be asking for binomial distribution. And if you don't know enough to be able to calculate the standard deviation, which is a part of the binomial distribution, then you're not going to get binomial distribution. And the same thing with chapter 3 when you're doing the standard deviation. The author's going to give you the data, and he's expecting you to know to calculate the mean, which you covered in chapter 1. He's not going to tell you to cover the mean. Okay? All right, so that's just an FYI, not to scare you or anything, but just to give you a heads up, when you're keep that in the back of your mind when you're doing business statistics. Okay? So now we're going to do the standard deviation. Okay, so what's the standard deviation? Right, the first thing we did was, of course, we needed to calculate the mean, which was 64.6. Okay, and now we have to take the sum of the squared deviations. Oops. We have to take the sum of the squared deviations. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to find out what the deviations are. Okay, to find the deviations, we take each data point and we subtract the mean. So I have 67 as my first data point. I subtract the mean of 64.6. Okay, and I end up with 2.4. I would take 58 minus 64.6 and get 6.6, a minus 6.6. Okay, and I'm going to keep on doing that for all 20 data points. So I'll have 20 deviations. Okay, so the first thing is what's the deviation? Well, these are your deviations. Remember, we're going to have 20 of them here. Okay, so these are your deviations. Then the next thing you do is you have to, what does it say? You square them, right? So that means 2.4 squared minus 6.6 squared, and each one of these 20 deviations squared. Well, to square something, you take the number and you multiply it by itself. Okay, 2.4 times 2.4 gives me 5.76. So 2.4 squared is 5.76. A minus 6.6 times a minus 6.6 is 43.56. A minus times a minus gives you a plus. A plus times a plus gives you a plus. So all of your squared deviations here are all going to be positive numbers. And so you end up doing all 20 of those, and you get all of these. Okay. The third thing that the next step you have to do is you have to sum it, meaning you have to add all of these up, the 5.76 plus the 43.56 plus whatever the remaining squared deviations were. Okay, we're going to add them all up, and when you add them all up, you end up with 478.8. Okay, so that's the sum of your squared deviations. All right. So let me back up a little bit and go over it again. Okay, and I'm going to do this in black. All right, so 1, you found the mean. Okay, you just took the average of all 20 of these, add them all up, you divide it by 20, and that gave you the mean of 64.6. So the next thing you're going to do to try to find the standard deviation is you're going to take the sum of the squared deviations. But notice that I did this sort of backwards from the way it was written. The first thing I have to do is, what's the deviations? Well, the deviation is how far away from the mean is each data point. So I take 67 minus the mean of 64.6, and that gave me 2.4. Right? I took 58 from 64. I took 58 minus the 64.6, and I end up with a minus 6.6. So those are all of my deviations, number 1. Then the second thing I have to do is I have to square each one of those deviations. So I take the 2.4 and square it, which gave me 5.76. I take the minus 6.6 and I square it, and that gives me 43.56. Remember, a minus times a minus is a positive. So when I'm trying to do a minus here, all I need to do is just take the 6.6 times the 6.6. I don't have to punch in the negatives, okay, into the calculator. So I end up getting all of the deviations squared, okay, as step number 2. Then as step number 3 here, I add them all up. I add all of what these are, the sum of all of these, and I come up with 478.8. Okay. So pause the video and write all of this down if you have to right at this point in time, because I'm going to erase all of this so that I can work with it. Because we're sitting here now at 478.8 as the sum of the squared deviations. Okay, so pause the video and write what you have to write down and come back and start the video up again. Okay, I'm erasing everything here. And so I know that is 478.8 deviations. Okay, so I have 478.8. So that's going to go in my numerator, 478.8. Okay, and then in the denominator, we take the number of data points minus 1. Okay, well, the number of data points in this case is 20. So I take 20 minus 1, which gives me 19. So I'm dividing 478.8 by 19. And that's going to give me 25.2. Right. Now, the last step that we have to do is we have to take the 25.2 and take the square root of it. Terrible looking square root, right? We take the square root of it. And remember, to do that in the calculator, in your basic calculator, you have a square root key. So clear out your calculator, punch 25.2 into it, and then just hit the square root key, and that gives you 5.01996. And it's telling me to round to the nearest hundredth. So this is the hundredth, and the next digit over is 9, so I'm going to round up. So I end up with 5.02 is my standard deviation. Okay, right, so that's how you go about doing this. You end up with, just to reiterate from where you pause the video, you found the sum of the squared deviations is 478.8. then you're going to divide that by the number of data points minus 1. Okay, and by the way, the n minus 1 is referring to what's called a sample. Okay, and if you recall from my theory videos, you know, I had started covering the concept of having a population and a sample, meaning a sample is a subset of the population. Well, you end up doing both the population and the sample, the standard deviation, basically the exact same way, with the exception of what is in the denominator right here. For the sample, it's n minus 1, but for the population, it would be actually just be n itself, and it would be denoted by a capital N. So if this was my entire population, I would have had 478.8 divided by 20, because I'm dealing with a population. But because if I'm dealing with a sample, it's a small n. Notice the hint, the mnemonic here. A capital N for population because it's bigger. A small n for sample because it's smaller. Okay, so n minus 1 for a sample. Now I realize that wasn't covered in this chapter, and that's fine. But this is just a heads up for you when you end up in business statistics. For the simple reason that if you learn how to do this, well then basically you know how to do both and all you need to do is just know how to alter that portion of the calculation, and you're able to do the other work. You don't have to memorize two different things. You know the concept for one, a little tweak, and you have the concept for the other. Okay, so back to this problem. We had 20 data points minus 1, which gave us 19. When we divide it, we ended up with 25.2. And then we take the square root of the 25.2 in order to get our standard deviation of 5.02. Right? So that's it for these word problems. And we're in the next set of videos on the summary practice test. We're actually getting into the the last thing that we have to do in this textbook. So, all right, I'll see you in the next set of videos, and if you have any questions, feel free to give an instructor a call.